Hello, and welcome everybody to our webinar this morning, this afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm actually in the UK this week, so it's 4 p.m. for me, but 11 a.m. back in Canada in Eastern Time Zone, and welcome from wherever you may be joining. Today's topic is going to be about safe sharing with Purview Information Protection and the traffic light protocol. So we'll start with some quick intros here. If you haven't been on a talk with me before, my name is Peter Carson. I'm the president and founder of both Extranet User Manager and Envision IT. One company, two brands, located in the Toronto area in Canada. Also 14-time Microsoft M365 MVP, so do a lot of speaking at conferences as well as lots of webinars and such. We're going to be providing the deck as well as the recording after the webinar, so you'll have all my contact information and any links from the webinar available to you. A couple key takeaways just to start with, before we dive into the topic. What's the key reason for being here? And first and foremost, sharing will happen in every organization, but will it be safe? And that's the title of this one is safe sharing. Microsoft 365, when it's properly configured, can be both secure and simple, which sounds like a oxymoron, but it is possible to achieve both of those things. And thirdly, there's a lot that we're going to be covering here. You don't need to start with it all. Start small and build from there is sort of the key message from that point of view. So a little bit about us, if you're not familiar with Extranet User Manager. Our tagline as an organization is we make Microsoft simple. I know that's a ultimately unachievable goal, but we still aspire to it. I mean, mainly we focus around the external sharing side of things when we're talking about making it simple. But even in that context, there can be a lot of complexity around that. We want to have an exceptional user experience, not just for the folks that you're sharing content with and collaborating with external to your organization, but the business folks that are doing that sharing as well. If it's not simple, they're going to find a different way, which may not be safe. And we want to make those two things happen together. IT is very involved at the beginning of these processes in terms of configuring Microsoft 365, but once properly set up, really the business can focus on what they need to get done. And IT should not be a gatekeeper in the process from there. So a quick overview of agenda. We've done the introductions. We're going to start with some challenges around sharing. We're going to do a little explanation of what Microsoft Purview is. We're not going to be covering all of it in today's session. We're going to be focusing in on a particular area of it. We'll get into what's called the traffic light protocol, which is not a technology solution. It's a way of simplifying information sensitivity classification, and then we'll dive into the implementation side of it. I'll be doing a fair bit of slides, but also jumping out into a live demo as well, just to illustrate the concepts as we go through here. I do have the Teams window on my other monitor here. I'll try and keep an eye on the chat, but folks on the Envision IT side, Amanda, Kevin, I'm not sure if we have Logan, feel free to jump in at the appropriate spot if there's questions that come up do you think are relevant to what I'm talking about at that point in time. Okay, so let's talk about the hidden costs of insecure sharing. Sharing can happen in a lot of ways in a lot of organizations, and there's a lot of downsides to doing it insecurely. Obviously, data loss is a big concern, but just the financial drain if shadow IT starts to get spun up in the organization, sort of double spending on additional vendors when Microsoft actually provides what you need out of the box and you're already spending on that. Cyber attacks and cybersecurity is obviously super critical. Proper protection of your information, particularly as it gets more sensitive. Not fully utilizing your Microsoft 365 investments, and also just process management inefficiencies. Moving stuff around between multiple different systems isn't just insecure and unsafe, it's also inefficient. So how do we make that more efficient and make it easy to do things from that perspective? There's lots of choices. I mean, this set of icons here is not a all-encompassing of how you might want to do under the radar or shadow IT sharing. I mean, Dropbox, Google Drive, Box, ShareFile, lots of examples that we see with clients and with folks that we talk to where the business has said, hey, the IT has just made it too difficult to use Microsoft 365, or it's too complicated, it's not simple, I don't understand it, so I'm not going to use it. and I'm just going to get my credit card out and spin up some shadow IT. And sometimes it's not even shadow IT. Sometimes it's personal services. I was chatting with a consultant this morning and was saying, yeah, often when I need to share stuff, IT rules block it, and I just use my personal OneDrive to share things. Sure, that works, but it's not really an appropriate way to manage corporate content, particularly more sensitive content. It shouldn't be going into personal services. It shouldn't be going into SaaS shadow IT services either. Not to say that Box can't be configured very securely. It can be. But why are you purchasing another service when you're already all in on Microsoft and you've got Microsoft 365 in your organization? You're adding complexity, you're adding additional cost by bringing another service in on top of that. So why choose Microsoft 365? I mean, for the organizations that we predominantly talk to, it's the place the employees are already working. You've got your Office tools, Word, Excel, PowerPoint. You've got Outlook and email already in Microsoft 365. You're using OneDrive. You're using SharePoint and Teams and team sites. So, I mean, you're already all in from that perspective. Why not just continue to use it from a sharing point of view? It's got super robust security features. Microsoft invests massively from a cybersecurity point of view, in excess of $1 billion a year just on cybersecurity testing and such, and also just watching what's happening out in the market as a whole. And for them, the market is global. I mean, there's 300 million active users on Teams. They're watching signals from that to say, hey, where are people getting compromised? What's happening? Is there trends, things that we learn from protecting one client that we can be proactive with another one from there? So there's a lot of benefit in building on top of that. And pretty much every compliance certification you can think of, they have as part of that. Global ones like ISO 27001, but country-specific ones as well. In Canada, they've been for a number of years certified for protected B assets. That means a fairly high sensitivity of government confidential documents, and those are okay to store in the Microsoft cloud. Now they should be treated appropriately though, and that's really what we're going to talk about here today. So what are our sharing options in Microsoft 365? And typically when we talk to organizations, they're in one of the first two buckets. Either it's wide open and it's a Wild West, anything goes, there's all sorts of oversharing going on. And that's frightening if you're the IT or the compliance person in that organization, because you really don't have a handle of what's going on. Often the knee-jerk response to that is we're just going to turn off all sharing. And we see clients that have done that in their tenant as well. You can control that at the tenant level and say there is no external sharing. I can't invite people to Teams. I can't bring them into SharePoint. That's not allowed from that point of view. That's not a great response either, because you should expect lots of shadow IT and email attachments. It's not that you've stopped all sharing. You've stopped all sharing through Microsoft 365. And it's still going to happen. It's going to happen other ways that you don't know about. Therefore, you can't control, and you don't know if it's safe and secure from that perspective. The one we're going to talk about here is leveraging Microsoft Purview, and I'll explain what that is in a minute, to provide governance and policies around that. And it's not a one-size-fits-all. We're going to talk about different levels of sensitivity, and you should treat content in different ways as appropriate. And again, the knee-jerk response might be, well, I need the most secure solution that anything in the organization might need, and everybody should always use that. And that's not actually the right response. It's kind of like saying, I want the most secure computer. Well, unplug it and lock it in a closed room so nobody has access to it. It's super secure, but it's completely useless because nobody can use it. So there's got to be a balance in there between security and usability. They're not polar opposites. You do want to find the blend between those. Okay, so let's dive a little more into what Microsoft Purview is. So it is a big suite of products. It's kind of been mashed together from a number of different products. You may know it under different names. The compliance tools are primarily what it was known as before. There's sort of some key pillars. We're not going to cover all of these, but we're going to go into some of them. So the idea of unified data governance, to say, hey, we're going to have a common platform for data governance. And it's not just for Microsoft repositories or even just for Microsoft 365. You can use it for other Microsoft tooling, Azure, SQL, things like that. But you can also apply it to resources that are outside. You may have content stored in Amazon Web Services and you want to provide governance around that. Purview can actually provide that. We're not going to get into that here, but it is part of what it can do. So a big part of it is data discovery and classification. People don't like to go through and tag information, and we're going to talk about different scenarios of where you deploy Purview, and one of them, comes with a higher cost from a licensing point of view, but allows automated scanning and classification. So you can actually build rules that look for particular content, and Microsoft has a bunch of out-of-the-box rules. I was going through this with Essential Computing. I'm actually in their office here today. We did a session to kind of deeper dive on this topic this morning. And we went through the auto rules. And there's a financial UK rule set that looks for things like credit card numbers, UK debit card numbers, SWIFT codes as potential PCI data, personal credit information data that should be highly sensitive and classified accordingly. So you can pick and choose which rules make sense for you as an organization. From an integration point of view, Purview is integrated into a lot of different tools. We're going to focus on the Microsoft 365 integration, but Synapse, Power BI, Fabric, a lot of different Microsoft tools, it's already built in from that point of view. And then from a compliance and security, this is where we're going to spend a lot of our time, protecting sensitive data through a number of different features. So there's things like data loss prevention and e-discovery. We're not going to go into as much. Those are sort of reactive to say, hey, somebody's trying to do something like attach a sensitive document to an email. I'm going to block them from doing that. Or conversely, looking after the fact in an e-discovery scenario to say, hey, we're getting sued by somebody. I need to find all the emails and all the documents that relate to that particular case, put a legal hold on it, make sure that they're retained and nobody deletes anything from that point of view. That's part of Purview as well. So as you can see, it's a pretty big beast, but we're going to drill in a little deeper to one part of it. Now, one point that I want to make early on is around this concept of labels in Purview, and this causes a lot of confusion because there's what's called retention labels and sensitivity labels in Purview. They're both called labels, which means people often confuse them and think they're the same thing or they're somehow related to each other or connected. They're really not. Retention labels are really about managing the life cycle of your data. So if you think about a highly regulated industry, public sector, banking, things like that, they have very strict rules of how long they have to retain content and what should happen when that time period is over. We have to hold all tax-related documents for 7 years, after which there's actually a liability for continuing to retain them. They should be disposed of permanently. There's different rules around retention and disposition, and that's what retention labels define. And typically they're to provide compliance with, government regulations, internal policies, things like that. And often, retention labels can number up into the hundreds. They can be very complex file plan structure and label structure. Now, sensitive labels are different. They're about protecting sensitive information. So they're not about the life cycle. They're saying, hey, how sensitive, how private is this information? So about classifying and securing it and deciding how is that content both handled and shared. And typically we see a small number of labels here. So if you're thinking about, hundreds of labels in this super complex file plan and people aren't going to be able to understand that and apply it, on the sensitivity side, it should be a much smaller set from that perspective, and that's the approach that we take here. So diving into Purview Information Protection. So this is part of the Purview side that predominantly deals with the sensitivity labels. It also includes things like the data loss prevention. So it's about discovering, classifying, and protecting the sensitive data. So how do you find that sensitive data? You could have people self-identify and say, hey, I see this document, I know it has personal health information in it, I'm going to tag it appropriately from there, or saying, hey, we're going to build some automated rules around that to apply those labels. And once those labels have been applied, they're going to enforce protection policies. So things like document encryption, access restrictions, things like watermarks and visual marks that can be put onto the documents so people are aware of the sensitivity of the content that they're looking at and manipulating. I mentioned data loss prevention. I mean, that's more from a Teams and an email point of view predominantly to say, hey, who's attaching what where, and does that make sense, and how do I prevent that from a data breach point of view? The AI-powered classifiers, this is above and beyond sort of the simpler rules that say, hey, look for this pattern match of a credit card number, and start to build some AI models to look for that content and apply labels appropriately from there. So there's different ways to auto-classify and apply labels. Can't be a Microsoft talk without talking about licensing, and this does get quite complicated. There's no hard and fast here. Really, every organization is a little different. We have to look at what licenses they have in place, what they're looking to do, and what, if any, they need to true up from that point of view. At the end of the day, E3 or higher is typically what's required to use Purview in your Microsoft 365. There are some other pieces as part of that. It might be that you have a Microsoft 365 E3 or E5. That's typically going to cover you for everything that you need. But if you have a lesser license like an E1 or even a F1 or F3, you can purchase compliance licenses, which are add-ons to those core licenses to give you the compliance requirements. Now, a bunch of the stuff that we're going to talk about gets into security. That needs Enter ID, P1 as well. Again, if you've got a Microsoft 365, E3 or E5, that's going to include it. You might have EMS as an add-on in there. So again, I know I'm throwing a lot of acronyms at you. We're not licensing experts. We know enough to be dangerous, but we can help you have discussions with your cloud solution provider and licensing provider if you want to navigate through that from that perspective. Also, can't have a Microsoft talk these days without talking about Copilot. What we're talking about here today actually has a lot to do with Copilot readiness, which is a phrase you may have heard of. It's been quite hot now. Senior leadership is obviously very keen on AI, and they want to see the benefits in their organization from a productivity point of view. So they are keen to see Copilot turned on. But before you do that, what do you need to do from a readiness point of view? And two key things here. One, on the left, less to do with Purview, is more about permissions management. Oversharing is very common. People often have access to content that they shouldn't. And I don't just mean external sharing. I mean sharing within the organization as well. And you need to make sure that you've got a good handle on that. I mean, we saw this go badly with organizations with Microsoft Delve a number of years ago. If you're not familiar, it was a tool for doing sort of document discovery of people around you. What are they working on that I have access to as well that I might be interested in? And conceptually, it was great, but we had more than one client phone us in a panic and say, hey, you've got to turn Delve off because people have access to confidential HR information that nobody should see, and Delve is exposing it to. And I'm like, that's not a Delve problem. That's a permissions problem. You've set your tenant up incorrectly, and you're oversharing. And you're not just going to see that in Delve, you're going to see that in the search as well. People are potentially going to search it and find it from that perspective. And the same applies to Copilot. Copilot will reach out through search because it uses search extensively as it's forming responses to your prompts that you put into it. And it will incorporate any content that you have access to. It won't incorporate content that you're not allowed to see. But if you're not supposed to see it, but somebody's done a wrong job and overshared it with you, it's quite happy to ingest it and make it part of the response there. So that permissions review is really a key thing to do prior to launching Copilot. I mean, you can take the shortcut right now and say, hey, I want to turn search off for huge swaths of my organization because I haven't had time to review the permissions. And I just want a Copilot to point at this particular area. Yeah, that will work, but ultimately you do need to deal with this and look at the permissions. The sensitivity side, where this becomes important, is that without the labels and the sensitivity, Copilot has no idea what the sensitivity of the content is that it's using. And you may have permissions, and it may be perfectly valid for you to see, personal health information of patients in your healthcare organization. But you ask a question to Copilot, and Copilot doesn't know why you're asking that question or what sensitivity of content it should use. But if it is properly labeled, it at a minimum can inform you and say, hey, I've used high sensitivity content in this generated content. I haven't delved too deep into the prompt engineering side. Can you coach Copilot and say, hey, I just want low sensitivity information gathered as part of the response to this prompt that I'm giving you, and have it come back appropriately? Because what you don't want to have happen is ask a question through a prompt, have it use some highly sensitive content to form a response, give it back to you, you not be aware of that, and then you share it out as if it's fairly public or low sensitivity content, when in fact it was compiled from highly sensitive content. So Purview really helps from that point of view. So these are two key things you should think about from a Copilot readiness perspective. Okay, so let's switch around to the traffic light protocol. So first and foremost, this is not a technical solution. It's not part of Purview. It's not something you get out of the box from Microsoft. It's actually a a classification system that was first developed by the UK back in the early 2000s. So it's been around for 20 years or so now at this point here, and really it's encouraging sharing of sensitive information, and that sounds like a bad thing, but it's actually not. But it's making everybody aware of what the sensitivity of that information is that they're sharing. And it's pretty easy to understand green, amber, red from that point of view. Now, you don't have to use the colors. The idea here is to have a very simple set of hierarchy that's clear to understand the order of that hierarchy. What you don't want to have is, say, classified and secret and confidential as your labels, because nobody has a clear sense of which is more important than the other. You could use a low, medium, and high sensitivity. That's perfectly acceptable. The idea is to make it easy to understand and not too many levels in there from that point of view. So what we've done is started to incorporate that with Purview and with Microsoft 365, not just from a sharing point of view, but from a how information is labeled and handled within the organization. And what we found when we're talking to clients is most of our clients are actually licensed at a minimum to the E3 level. Very few of them are actually using information protection. So they're paying Microsoft for the services that are provided in Purview, but they're actually not making use of them. And it's super critical, not just for big enterprises. I see this as important for smaller organizations as well. And having a simple structure so it's not an onerous process to apply is going to help with the change management around that. So really there's 4 levels. It actually starts at clear, and clear is completely public information. You're fine to post this on your website. There are no restrictions from a sensitivity point of view. Green is the lowest of the sensitive. And what we've done is started to put some interpretations, not of what these labels mean, but what they cause to have happen. And what green, amber, red mean for your business and your organization is a business discussion. That's something that we can help you with, but you may in fact need to bring in some external experts, that have information labeling experience in your particular field to help define the rules and provide them to your staff so they understand where to apply which label from that point of view. What we're doing here is driving the result of those labels. Now, you notice the difference between amber and green is one allows guests without MFA, which is multi-factor authentication. This is the ability to say, hey, you don't just have a username and password to come into our system. You need a second factor of authentication, like your mobile device. And this has become very common. In fact, every organization using Microsoft 365, 100% of their member accounts, their licensed staff that are coming to Microsoft 365, should be using MFA. If your organization doesn't enforce that for your members, that's a problem, and you should fix that just from a baseline security point of view. But do all guests need MFA? And again, the quick response might be MFA, increases security by 1,000-fold, which it actually does. Therefore, we should have it on for every single user. But you have to think about what's the sensitivity of that content, and do we need to inflict that pain from that point of view? Because it is pain. If I'm a guest that's coming in, I've never signed into your tenant before. I don't know anything about Microsoft 365. I'm not a technical person. Maybe I'm a frontline worker. Maybe I'm a partner in a sort of hands-on type of industry that doesn't work with technology. Setting up multi-factor authentication is an onerous process, and you may lose me. I may give up and say, sorry, this is too complicated. I just can't do it. So you have to think about what they're coming in for. In fact, one of the external sharing scenarios that we do a lot with is with our partner company, Zensight. They are a learning management solution provider built on top of Microsoft 365. So people need to sign into Microsoft 365 to access their learning content. But those people may be very much frontline workers or are contractors and such that are not working on a computer day to day, may not even have a personal email address. Maybe an SMS number is really their only point of contact. And to force those people through MFA to say, take some workplace safety training, just doesn't make sense. I mean, what's the risk if somebody hacks that? Well, they get trained on how to be safe in the workplace. It's not a bad thing. So you really need to balance what is it that you're providing access to and what controls do you need to have around that. Now, as we come up the queue into amber, we're saying, hey, this is sensitive information. We want to make sure that those external users that are coming in are actually going through multi-factor authentication. And as we get up to red, examples of this would be things like personal health information. You're an insurance company and you're trading medical records back and forth with a medical lab that's providing diagnostic services for somebody that's doing a disability or an accident benefits claim. There's a lot of PHI data. It's highly sensitive. It should be treated as red. And what red means is not only do you require MFA, but those documents should also be encrypted. So if they go off the side, that's a tough thing. So, question there from Jean. Good catch. So you'll notice that there's strict and non-strict labels in the labeling here. And the amber strict versus amber is something that we commonly see. The red strict is something that you won't find in the official TLP documentation. We've included it in there because to say that a document is red and includes highly sensitive information like personal health or personal credit information, but you're never, ever, ever allowed to share it external to the organization actually doesn't make sense. That example of insurance company is a real example where we have a client who has millions and millions of documents and a good chunk of them have personal health information in there, and they have an absolute business requirement to share those with external medical providers to get that content back and forth. It should be read, it should be encrypted, but we are allowing external sharing in that scenario. So it's a little deviation from the protocol, and it's not a hard and fast. I mean, the traffic light protocol was a guidance, not a strict prescription. And beyond that, I mean, what we've provided here, kind of laid out in a matrix format here, is not how Microsoft says to implement traffic light protocol. In fact, Microsoft doesn't explain at all. Traffic light protocol is something outside of Microsoft itself. It's something that we've given as a framework to start the discussion, to say, hey, here's some suggestions on how you might want to structure the TLP labels and in the Microsoft 365 scenario where there is external access controls, which ones do you want to say, no, it's red strict, it's internal eyes only, or amber strict, internal eyes only, there is no external access. Which ones are you happy with somebody coming in like a green level and not requiring MFA? Because you don't want to lose that guest coming in through the burden of having to set multi-factor authentication up, and the content is such a low sensitivity, there's not really a requirement for it. But as you come into amber, there is. And do we need document encryption? You could argue that we don't want the red strict versus red label. Red just means it can't be externally shared, but everything at the amber level should be encrypted as well. So don't consider this a Bible. It's more of a guide to say, here's a starting point, here's a framework that you can use from that point of view. Even the licensing on the right-hand side here is not a hard and fast. I mean, we're kind of suggesting that you probably want to have E5 or E5 compliance licensing to get to the red document encryption level, because you're applying labels to individual documents, and you kind of want to do that automatically. Saying to people, hey, manually pick your labels is pretty onerous, and a lot of people won't do it, but E5 lets you do that automatically. It's not to say you couldn't have red and red strict labels in an E3 license scenario and just say, hey, those labels need to be manually applied. Because unfortunately, even something as simple as saying, I want to have a default label for my document library in SharePoint, it's considered automation by Microsoft and requires the E5 license. So even very light touch things ultimately require that licensing. Now, other third-party products, Essential was taking me through what AppPoint does around this, and they've got some cool tooling that I need to dig deeper on that may relax some of the licensing restrictions here. Again, that's a deeper conversation. So just quick summary again on the different levels. So green is very low sensitivity. It's fine to share externally, and actually we're not going to enforce a multi-factor authentication requirement for external guests. All your members always need to go through MFA, that's a given, but for guests and green content, we'll let them in without that. And training being the obvious one, but there may be other content. Maybe you're working with your design agency, trading some infographics back and forth for some marketing materials, and you need a place to share that. That could be considered TLP green, unless there's highly confidential in there. But if it's ultimately going to go up on your public website, it's probably not that sensitive, and maybe we don't need MFA on there. So again, it needs to be a business conversation to understand what should be green, what should be amber, what should be red from that perspective. Amber takes it up a level, says, hey, this is medium sensitivity content. It's still okay to share externally, but now we're going to put that requirement in to require multi-factor authentication. And that amber strict says, hey, this is not for external sharing. And then at the red level, we take it up another level there again and say, hey, content is going to be encrypted. Now, it doesn't mean that all content is going to be encrypted. We'll get into the Azure Rights Management and information protection. It will only encrypt Office documents, so Word, Excel, PowerPoint, for example, and PDF documents, which you need to turn on separately from an encryption point of view, because the client applications that you would use to view those documents actually need to understand Azure Information Protection and how to do that decryption. I'll show you some infographics later of what that process looks like from that perspective. I mean, I would argue that if I look at our own tenant, and we're fairly small, we're 24 people, but most of our tenants should probably be labeled as amber or amber strict. We do a lot of sharing with our clients or partners. That's what a lot of our sites are related to that. I see those as amber sites. They can be shared externally, but we don't need encryption on there. We discourage it, but occasionally clients need to provide us, dumps from their system that may have PII or we never accept PHI data, but sometimes personally identifiable information. We should probably label that as red. Do we need E5 to auto-label that? Probably not. I mean, we could apply a label in those cases because they're quite small from that point of view. So that's kind of our scenario. And each organization is going to be different. It'll be a conversation to determine what that looks like. So at the end of all this, what are the benefits of using this traffic light protocol with Microsoft 365? Is you get that, excuse me, secure external sharing. And it's not an all or nothing. Things like multi-factor authentication and encryption only come into play when appropriate. There's a very clear low, medium, high pattern there in terms of how we classify that sensitive data. And we've got all the governance and protection delivered through Microsoft Purview, which in a lot of organizations you're already paying for. So it's not actually additional licensing from that point of view. Okay, so let's dive in a little deeper here for a second. Actually, before I do this, let me take you through some live scenarios of what this could look like. So I've got a couple different sites here in our demo tenant. This one here is called TLP Red. So it's actually got the red label applied to the site. And the way we see that, I won't go into how the labels are all set up. That's fairly complex. But in my site information here, in addition to the standard things, because we now have labels deployed and published to our tenant, we can see the sensitivity label applied to this site. So I can choose a different label through there. I need certain rights as an owner of this site to be able to change that label. So somebody I've invited in, whether they're a guest or a member within my organization, can't just arbitrarily change that label. It's a fairly strong role in terms of actually applying that label to the site. And typically what we would encourage is that you've got some sort of provisioning process and request process around new teams and new team sites and such in your tenant, and that you make this labeling process part of that. Somebody says, hey, I need a new team for a project that we're running. It's going to be a big project with a bunch of external vendors that I need to share and bring in. Okay, what type of content is going to be in there? Should it be a green, an amber, or a red level site? So you make that choice when you request it. And if you're using tools like Orchestry or AvePoint or Bind Tuning, Automate 365, there's a variety of vendors that have Teams governance tools. Most of those can apply a label at the point that that team or team site gets created. If not, you can come back in afterwards and apply that label through here. So that's it's called the container level. At the site level, I'm applying a label, and it infers some rules. It's not going to, by default, encrypt the documents in the site, but it's going to enforce the multi-factor rules to access this site. If I want to go deeper and say, hey, I want to look at the document library that's in here, and let's drill down into my data rooms folder in one of my data rooms and say, hey, I've added the sensitivity column to this document library so I can see how content is tagged. And I can see I've got one document here that's a JSON file. It's not an Office document. It's not a PDF document. I can't actually apply a label to it because that document can't be encrypted. But all the other ones have a TLP red label assigned to them. And the primary way that we did that was over here in the library settings, just like the site settings, we see a default sensitivity level pop up in here. Now, this requires the E5 to set the default labels. You may be able to configure it on your tenant without the E5. Microsoft's a little loose on how they enforce their licensing, but if you actually get audited by Microsoft from a license and compliance point of view, you could be in trouble if you're using the defaults and you're not actually licensed from an E5 perspective. So we've applied the default TLP label to this to say, hey, every document that goes in here has to have that label on it. Now, when you first set the library up, if you don't set the default, you bring a bunch of documents in and then you set the defaults. It only triggers when documents are added or changed in the library. So the existing documents won't get labeled as part of that. So you kind of want to set your labels up first and then migrate your content in if you're kind of building a new information architecture as part of that. So that allowed me to apply the labels at the individual documents. Now I may want to change those labels and override those defaults. So I can come in here into the document information panel, and I see for this one document that I've chosen, all the metadata related to it, including the sensitivity. Now this particular Excel we actually use in our data room product, and we haven't updated our data room product yet to be able to read and manipulate encrypted documents. So it breaks if I leave this default encryption on. So I actually need to switch it to none as part of that. Now, first, I need to have the rights to be able to do that. Not everybody does. Second, I need to provide justification to explain why I'm making this change. And all this gets audited. So if you need to go back later to say, hey, why did this get downgraded or upgraded from a sensitivity point of view? Who did that? It's all in your audit logs from that point of view. I can say, hey, that previous label was incorrect. Go ahead and change that. And that's now removed the label off of that document. Now, if I flip over here to another tab, I can come to another site called TLP Green. Guess what? It's the green label site. It also has documents in it. We haven't set up any sort of default labeling on the documents. We've just left the site as a whole as a green labeled sensitivity site. And I kind of like that approach to say, hey, let's have the site and the content that we're going to put in at the same level. I mean, we were messing around with Essential this morning and kind of messed up this site a little bit, but we wanted to experiment and say, hey, could I label a document as TLP red, even though it's in the green site? And yes, you can do that. I mean, you will need the rights to access encrypted document, which you may not have by default by just having access to a green site. So, you may expose that content to somebody, but they can't actually consume it and read it because it stays encrypted for them. So it's better to kind of match them together and say, hey, let's get consistency between the container level labels and the document level labels. Okay, so let's imagine now that we've got an external user that we want to bring into this site. And we said for TLP Green, there's no MFA requirement as part of that. So I'm going to come here to a new in private window, and I'm going to navigate to that same TLP Green site that I was just on. So I'm not logged in, and we were setting up some test users this morning. I'm just going to use one of those as a demo scenario. So the ptest5 at um.co is a test account that we have. Now, it's not associated with a Microsoft account or a Microsoft 365 organization, so it's using what's called a one-time passcode. The person signing in gets emailed a passcode to then provide access instead of a password. It's much easier. I'm actually a big fan of what Microsoft's done here. So if I come over here to my group mailbox for that test domain, let's just look at eom.co. And we can see this email just came in. So I grab that verification code, copy it, come back to my sign-in window and paste it in. And it's super easy to come in. Now, if I was a brand new user, I would have to consent to a couple of things to say, yes, I consent to sign into this site. There may be terms of use and different policies to get enforced as part of that. So I have to go through that process initially. I've already used that account, so it's gone through those steps from that point of view. But remember, there was no requirement for MFA to access a TLP Green site. Now, this particular user, though, I've also put them in a group that gives them access to the red site. You might say, well, why didn't it force me through MFA if I have access to a red site? It should have. No, because I haven't gone there yet. So it's done a nice job of balancing that to say, hey, even though you have access to the higher sensitivity content, I'm not going to enforce that MFA requirement if all you do is browse around these green labeled sites. That's cool. That's fine. You don't need to go through MFA. But if I come over to my browser and I say, hey, I want to go through and hit that TLP red site, you'll notice that even though my browser was already logged in, it forced me back to the Microsoft login. And it said, hey, I need you to go through the MFA. And if I hadn't set up MFA on my account yet, it would force me through setting up the Authenticator app and registering it and doing that whole process, which can be a fairly onerous. We've actually built a training video that we provide to our clients that they can provide to their external users to say, this is how you install the Authenticator app on your iOS or Android device. This is how you go through the setup process and logging in. It ended up being about a 7-minute video. So it's not as simple. There's a lot of back and forth, a lot of steps and tasks. And I know we say we make Microsoft simple. Unfortunately, we can't change that one. It has to follow a certain pattern through there. So our best way to make it simple was to say, hey, let's provide an easy to follow recording and training session of what they need to do to set that up. I should hurry up and approve this. So I'm on my mobile device here. I got the, oh, no, it already expired. Okay, so let me just send another request. There we go. I have to type in the number 18 on my phone in my Authenticator app. It just did a Face ID to confirm my identity, and now I'm in from there. So, I mean, once you're set up, it's not that onerous, but that initial setup scares a lot of people, particularly people that are not tech savvy. They're frightened just by the sign in and getting the code out of their email. You throw in installing another app on their phone and registering it and scanning a QR code and doing all those things. That can be a lot to go through from that point of view. You can see now I'm in the TLP Red content. So if I come over into my documents library here, come down into that data room where we had some documents, I'm able to open that Word document. And what it did was it actually decrypted it for me because I'm already signed in to enter ID. It knew that I had the rights to do that and allowed me to see the content. Now it is lorem ipsum, so it's not particularly sensitive, but you get the idea from that point of view. So that's sort of the different experiences from that perspective. In fact, if I come over to our portal, I'm going to show you more of this a little later. But right on the sign-in page, we've added a link here to say, hey, if you need some help signing in, come learn more here. And this is the recorded video with all the different steps that we have here of, okay, opening the welcome email, logging in, the remember me, the password, the one-time passcode, accepting the permissions, staying signed in, setting up Authenticator, accepting the terms of use. There's a lot of steps there. But for the appropriate content, I mean, one of our clients is using this on a site. They're a provincial healthcare agency, and they're working with service providers that deal with patients. They need to have that level of trust back and forth to say, yes, all of our SPO users are coming in through multi-factor authentication. Okay, let's jump back over to the slide here. So what caused that to happen? How did I get into the green site and not have to go through MFA and come to the red site? And it did prompt me for MFA, and it would have forced me to set it up if I didn't already have it. A big part of it's what's called conditional access policies. And depending on your tenant, you may or may not have these. You can set up what's called security defaults, which just forces MFA for everybody in your organization, including your guests. So if you want to do what we're doing here, you need to take it up a level from there and say, no, we're going to start using conditional access policies. And basically what they do is they use signals, like who's signing in and where are they signing in from. You may want to block certain countries or only allow a certain country. We were talking about a client this morning. They only want to allow logins from people who are physically in Ireland at the time of login. That's something you can easily do from a location signal here. What device are they coming in from? Do you need them to be on a, Enter ID or domain join device, a corporate laptop, for example, or do you not care? Can it be any device from that point of view? Where are they trying to go? What application are they trying to access? It doesn't have to be an all or nothing for everywhere. You can target it specifically to particular applications. And you can also bring in what's called real-time risk. So, Microsoft is looking at these signals not just from your tenant, but from the world as a whole. And if they see attacks happening or strange things happening, that can raise the threat level and change the real-time risk from that perspective. Maybe your account just got blasted by a spam bot trying to sign in, and you've had 1,000 login attempts from a brute force attack at the same time that you're logging in. That raises the real-time risk. And even if I was going to let you in without MFA before, maybe I should now. So those are the kind of things that you can do from a security point of view. Not related to what we're talking about, but just broadly from a baseline security perspective. So the policies basically take all of those signals in and they make a decision. Am I going to allow you access, block you access, or require MFA if you don't already have it before I let you into those applications and data through there? And there's lots of content up on Microsoft Learn that describe how this works. So that's part of the solution here. Next piece is a component called authentication context. So this is, conditional access policies you set up in the Enter ID portal. Authentication contexts also get defined there. There's not much to them. They're basically a name, and they're a connection between one or more sensitivity labels and one or more conditional access policies. And basically what they say is, hey, if I'm accessing an amber or a red labeled site, for example, that has an authentication context associated with it. And there's a conditional access policy that says, hey, if you're a guest, you have to go through MFA to access this content. That's how we build those kinds of rules. And we've got a whole procedure document that we started building out of how you set all this up in your tenant and how you go through that process. So that's basically how you build that out. So you might have one authentication context for green and clear sites that says guests don't require MFA, and another one for amber and red that says, yes, you do require MFA. When I hit that green site, it wasn't triggering the amber and red one, so it wasn't requiring me to go through MFA. But even though I was already signed in, when I then navigated over to the red site, it triggered the other conditional access policy and said, hey, hang on, before you proceed, I got to take you through MFA. Now, there's things you can do to mitigate the pain of setting up multi-factor authentication as well. Depending on your organization, there's the ability to trust other organizations' MFA. Let's take Essential and Extranet User Manager as an example. So we bring Essential into our tenant. We do a lot of sharing from that point of view. And we trust Essential's MFA processes that they have in place in their organization. We know that they're a well-run shop and they've got good security policies in place. So if somebody logs in and goes through their MFA, we say, if it's good enough for Essential, it's good enough for us, and they don't have to register another authenticator app registration for our tenant. We can actually use their tenants, which is already in place. So it does make the onboarding a lot simpler from that point of view. You have to decide, do you want to open it up to the world to say every other Microsoft 365 organization, I'm going to trust their MFA, or do you just pick particular organizations and just set it up on a case-by-case basis? There's arguments both ways, and it depends on your organization. But again, it's about making it simple. So you do the right things, you make it simpler for people to come in. So I talked about data encryption. So that red labeled site had the Word, Excel, PDF documents that were encrypted. So I mean, over on the left here, we've got our secret cola formula. It's water. I don't know what HFCS stands for. This is an infographic from Microsoft, and brown number 16. That's the secret recipe for Coca-Cola, for example. I don't want anybody to find out that secret recipe. So I'm going to label it as a red labeled document. And when I save it and save it, say, into a SharePoint or a team site, it's going to encrypt it. So it's going to turn it into a gobbledygook that, no matter how I look at it, it's not going to look like a recipe. I'm not going to be able to decipher it. It's also going to include a policy and a key all within that document, and it's going to store it into Microsoft 365. Now that policy can be very granular. You could say, you know what, I'm going to share this formula with you, but you're not allowed to print it. You're not allowed to copy it. You're not allowed to forward it to anybody else. You can put those rules in place to say, what exactly can somebody do with this document once you've decrypted it for them? They don't have carte blanche to do whatever they want. And it doesn't matter where they put that document. They could save the document. They could download it from Teams onto their local machine. They could then put it on a thumb drive and give it to Pepsi and say, here's Coke's secret formula. Unless that Pepsi person has the credentials to authenticate and authorize to decrypt that document, they can't do anything with it. So that's the beauty of the document encryption. You have to go through this authentication and authorization step where it gives you the content key back and lets you decode that document and see that document. So it remains protected. There's only certain things as you define that can be done with it. And you can actually do more than just encrypt it. You can actually put watermarks on it. You can put header and footer on it. Different things that you can do from a document manipulation point of view. So I know that's a lot. We've actually gone past the 45-minute. I was thinking I had an hour here. I apologize. So I'm still running here. The key is to start smaller. Say, hey, can we do a phase one implementation? We just define the container level labels and not worry maybe about the document encryption and the deeper stuff from that point of view. So we're starting with a lot of clients at this point here. Say, hey, let's just define the labels, set up the security around that, and do some inventory and labeling of existing sites. And that can really help to lock down the external sharing that may be oversharing and say, you know what, there's only these few labeled sites that allow external access. If you need to share something externally, you have to have it there, and then you can do that sharing and provide better protection from that point of view. And then phase two, you can go further and say, hey, let's actually define the document level rules. Let's configure the Azure services that allow you to do the rights management and the encryption. Maybe let's set up the auto labeling so documents get auto labeled as part of that, and further security policies around there. So a couple examples, all in the public sector. Oddly enough, I see as much application in the private sector, which is just where we've happened to do this. We've got a mid-sized Ontario city where they had a big M365 implementation. It was COVID. They rolled out Teams for everybody. It became the Wild West, and really they wanted to reorganize that and say, hey, we've got more teams than people, even though we have thousands of employees, and we've got to get that under control. So let's get a Teams First IA together as part of that. And then, on the heels of that, which is where we're at now on the project, because we've pretty much got a handle on the organization, is to put the lifecycle management in, and let's get some policies and sharing in from that point of view. A similar situation with a federal, provincial, municipal agency. Again, completing a large enterprise content management migration strategy and implementing Purview is part of that. And the third one in the healthcare space, moving from a lot of on-premises SharePoint and file shares, bringing all that into SharePoint Online. Obviously, potential for a lot of PHI data here, making sure that we've got the appropriate Purview implementation. And this one actually has external users coming in, service providers that they're working with, large numbers of which they need to bring in. We're actually using our product to help manage those guest users and where they go from that point of view. So things that you can do from here, we deliver we call it a Purview Information Protection Workshop. It's sort of a deeper view of this session here and what it would mean to an organization to implement information protection. We also have a Power BI dashboard that we're building out, both a free version and a premium version that will actually inventory your Microsoft 365 tenant, give you a sense of how many different groups you have, how many are being shared externally, which are active versus inactive. And this is all drillable down through so you can actually interact and navigate through that. We've got a full Purview engagement, like those 3 projects that I was talking about, starting with the workshop, but actually doing the configuration, doing the change management, building that external sharing strategy, building the information architecture around that. So that's a bigger engagement. We have our own product side, the data room. I'll show you really quick here. I know I'm over, but I had it queued up. So if I come back over to this portal here, and if I was on the red site, for example, I've actually got links to the data rooms here. So if I go into that TLP Red data room, the idea of the product is to provide a branded experience, very simple experience for those external users to come in and interact with the content that still stays in your Microsoft 365. We're not putting it out in a portal. The portal is just providing a window into it from there. Oh, and I think I've messed up my demo. If I can quickly fix that or not. Like I said, I know I had to take the label off that particular document. I think it keeps reapplying it for me. Oh, SharePoint's going crazy on me. Okay, let's try this again. Come down into my folder. Yes, it's put the red label. It must keep reapplying the default, even though I'm taking it off. So we're gonna have to fix that. So let's take that label off. And come back to our data room page. So this is a view into that folder that I have in SharePoint. And that Excel that I was taking the label off defines information about the data room, like what's its name and status and who's the main contact, what's the dates around it. You can define whatever fields you want in that Excel, and this will morph and change from here. Maybe the scenario is that you need to collect documents from an external party. So you've got a concept of requested documents. You can say, hey, in the Excel, name the documents that I need to collect from the organization as part of this. And as they upload documents in through here, they're literally dropping them into the Microsoft 365. And if it's red labeled like this, they'll get encrypted. The default label will get applied. You'll be able to leverage all of that. But the folks coming in don't need to know or care about that. They see a very simple portal with only a few things that they can do as part of that. And that's really the concept around the data room. Okay, so John, I think we need to mute you. Hang on. There we go. So, the key takeaways that we covered at the beginning, sharing's going to happen, make sure it's safe. Microsoft 365 is a great spot to do, and start small and build from there. Don't try and do all of this. Figure out, what are the beginning points and how do we make this a journey and a series of steps from a change management point of view. Some upcoming events. So I'm going to be at Collab Days in Bletchley Park next week, hence why I'm here in the UK. Out in Vancouver for the AI Community Conference, and also doing a talk online, another webinar at the end of October on AI search and OpenAI. So if you want to get more into the, sort of Copilot and AI stuff, happy to chat more about that. So from there, apologies for going 10 minutes over, but hope that was helpful for everybody. I didn't get a chance to look too closely in here. Sarah was asking about TLP working with Copilot. Touched on that at the beginning. Yeah, it's an area we've got to dive deeper in. It will surface the fact that it's used sensitive content as part of its responses. Where we need to go further is, can you ground it and say, hey, I only want low sensitivity content as part of that from that point of view. So with that, thanks everybody for joining, and by all means, reach out if you've got further questions from there. Thanks everyone. Bye now.